The initial atmospheric transition into the atmosphere of the planet known only as O449 was not marked by the jarring turbulence one might expect from a world possessing such a dense, nitrogen-heavy shroud. Instead, the vessel descended with a rhythmic, almost organic swaying that suggested the air itself was resisting the intrusion of cold, precision-engineered metal. Silas sat within the command cradle, his hands hovering centimeters above the hilt controls that interfaced directly with the ship's internal navigation matrix. He did not use his eyes to see the world below, for the external cameras were currently blinded by the refractive properties of the upper ionosphere. Instead, he felt the world through the haptic feedback loops of the hull, a sensory translation that turned atmospheric pressure into a dull thrum against his palms and gravitational anomalies into a sharp tug at the base of his spine. The ship, a long-range exploration craft named the Pathbreaker, was a marvel of minimalist engineering, stripped of all unnecessary ornamentation to make room for the massive fuel cells required for trans-sector jumps. It was a lonely existence, but Silas had long ago traded the comforts of the inner colonies for the silent satisfaction of being the first sentient being to cast a shadow on untouched soil. The mission parameters were simple in theory, but grueling in execution. Identify the source of the anomalous thermal signatures detected by the long-range orbital scanners and determine if the subterranean heat was a product of natural geothermal activity or something more organized. As the ship pierced the lower cloud deck, the visual feeds finally cleared, revealing a landscape that defied the standard models of planetary evolution. Below him lay a world of deep, bruised purples and vibrant, bioluminescent greens, where the flora did not grow toward the sun, but seemed to crawl along the jagged obsidian ridges like a slow-moving tide. There were no oceans here, only vast, shallow basins filled with a viscous, translucent liquid that shimmered with a pale inner light. Silas adjusted the thruster pitch, slowing the descent as the landing struts began to deploy with a series of muffled hydraulic thuds that echoed through the pressurized cabin. He chose a landing site on a plateau of solid basalt, situated between two towering spires of crystalline rock that acted as a natural windbreak against the high-altitude gusts. When the ship finally settled, the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of an entire ecosystem that had never known the sound of a combustion engine. Silas remained in his seat for several minutes, watching the external sensors calibrate to the local environment. The air was breathable, though heavy with noble gases that would make his voice sound unnaturally deep and resonant. He began the lengthy process of uncoupling himself from the ship's nervous system, withdrawing the neural needles from his temples with practiced care and stowing them in their shielded cases. Every movement was deliberate, a ritual designed to transition his mind from the vast, electronic scale of the ship back to the narrow, physical reality of his own body. He stood, his muscles protesting the sudden return of full gravity, and made his way toward the equipment locker. He donned his environmental suit, a sleek charcoal gray garment reinforced with ceramic plating and woven with a mesh of carbon nanotubes. It was designed to protect him from the extreme temperature fluctuations of the planet's surface while allowing for a full range of motion. He checked his utility belt, ensuring that the multi-tool, the portable scanner, and the emergency beacon were all securely fastened and fully charged. Finally, he sealed his helmet, the internal display flickering to life with a stream of data that mapped the terrain in a three-dimensional wireframe overlay. He cycled the airlock, the sound of his own breathing loud in the confined space, until the outer door hissed open and revealed the alien horizon. The air that rushed in was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and crushed mint, a scent that felt impossibly fresh after weeks of recycled ship air. Silas stepped out onto the boarding ramp, his boots crunching against the fine, volcanic sand that blanketed the plateau. He looked up at the sky, which was a deep, velvety indigo even during the height of the day, and saw the faint, ghostly outlines of the planet's 3 moons hanging like pale coins against the darkness. The sun was a distant, white point of light that provided heat but very little warmth, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the basalt like reaching fingers. He began his trek toward the northern ridge, where the thermal anomalies were most concentrated, his movements rhythmic and steady. The ground was uneven, littered with fragments of glass-like rock that caught the light and reflected it back in dazzling bursts of crimson and gold. As he walked, he noticed that the local flora was reacting to his presence. Small, tubular plants retracted into the soil at his approach, while larger, umbrella-like fungi tilted their caps toward him as if trying to catch his scent. It was a subtle, pervasive awareness that made him feel like an intruder in a well-ordered garden. He reached the edge of the plateau and looked down into the valley below, where a massive structure of blackened stone rose from the ground like a broken tooth. It was not natural. The angles were too sharp, the geometry too precise to be the result of erosion or tectonic shift. This was the source of the heat, a buried complex that breathed warmth into the surrounding atmosphere through a series of vents that glowed with a dull, orange light. Silas felt a surge of excitement tempered by a cautious dread. He was no longer just a cartographer, he was an archaeologist of the unknown. He began the descent into the valley, his boots skidding slightly on the loose scree as he navigated the steep incline. The air grew warmer as he approached the structure, the smell of ozone intensifying until it became a metallic tang at the back of his throat. He reached the base of the blackened stone wall and reached out to touch it, his gloved fingers tracing the faint, etched lines that ran across the surface in complex, interlocking patterns. The stone was warm, almost feverish, and he could feel a faint vibration beneath the surface, like the beating of a massive, distant heart. He followed the wall until he found a narrow opening, a vertical slit that seemed designed for something much taller and thinner than a human. He squeezed through, his suit brushing against the rough interior surfaces, and emerged into a vast, vaulted chamber that stretched upward into the darkness. The floor was polished smooth, reflecting the faint light from his helmet lamps in a way that made it seem like he was walking on water. In the center of the room stood a pillar of translucent crystal, filled with a swirling, golden mist that pulsed in time with the vibrations he had felt outside. This was the core, the engine of the complex, and it was still active after what must have been millennia of isolation. Silas approached the pillar, his scanner whining as it struggled to process the sheer volume of energy being emitted by the crystal. The data on his display began to glitch, the wireframe terrain replaced by a series of rapidly shifting symbols that he could not recognize. He realized then that this was not a simple power station. It was a repository, a library of information stored in a form that defied conventional digital storage. He reached out to touch the crystal, but before his fingers could make contact, the golden mist within flared into a brilliant, blinding light that filled the entire chamber. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the air, shaking the very foundations of the structure and rattling Silas's teeth within his skull. He tried to pull back, but he found that he could not move. He was held in place by a powerful electrostatic field that pinned his limbs to his sides. The symbols on his display began to move faster, coalescing into images of star systems he did not know and civilizations that had long since vanished into the dark between galaxies. He was being shown the history of a people who had mastered the art of stellar engineering, who had built worlds and harvested the energy of suns, only to be undone by their own ambition. The images flooded his mind, a torrent of sensory data that threatened to overwhelm his conscious thought. He saw cities of glass that floated above gas giants, fleets of ships that could fold the fabric of space like parchment, and finally, a great, cold silence that had swept across the stars and extinguished the lights of 1,000 worlds. The hum reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to tear at his very soul, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished and the pressure released. Silas collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as his vision slowly returned to normal. The golden mist within the pillar was gone, replaced by a dull grey smoke that swirled sluggishly. The vibration had ceased, and the chamber was once again plunged into a heavy, oppressive quiet. He lay there for a long time, his heart hammering against his ribs, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. He was not the same man who had landed on this planet hours ago. He carried within him the memories of a dead empire, a burden of knowledge that he had never asked for. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking with exhaustion, and looked at his scanner. The device was dead, its screen cracked, and its internal circuitry fried by the energy surge. He was alone in the dark, miles from his ship, with only the fading warmth of the stone to guide him back to the surface. He began the long trek out of the complex, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented images and half-formed thoughts. He knew that he could not stay on this planet, but he also knew that he could never truly leave it behind. The secrets of O449 were now his secrets, and the responsibility of preserving them weighed more heavily on him than the atmosphere of 100 worlds. He emerged from the vertical slit into the valley, the cool night air of the planet hitting him like a physical blow. The 3 moons were high in the sky now, casting a silver light over the landscape that made the obsidian ridges look like waves on a frozen sea. He looked back at the structure, which now seemed smaller, more fragile, a tomb for a greatness that the universe had forgotten. He began the climb back to the plateau, his movements slow and methodical, focused on the simple necessity of placing one foot in front of the other. The walk was long and grueling, his suit's internal power reserves beginning to dip into the red, but he did not stop. He reached the edge of the plateau just as the first light of the distant sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and pale gold. His ship sat where he had left it, a gleaming, metallic needle in the vast, dark expanse of the basalt. He reached the boarding ramp and triggered the airlock, the familiar hiss of the seals, a comfort he had not expected to feel. He entered the cabin and stripped off his helmet, the thick, heavy air of the planet filling his lungs one last time before the ship's scrubbers kicked in. He sat in the command cradle and began the pre-flight sequence, his fingers moving across the controls with a grace that felt new, as if his hands were being guided by the memories he now carried. The engines roared to life, a powerful, steady vibration that pushed him back into his seat as the ship began its ascent. He did not look back at the planet as he broke through the atmosphere and into the cold, clean vacuum of space. He had a new course to plot, a destination that was not on any map, guided by the golden light that still flickered in the corners of his mind. The stellar cartographer had found something more than just a new world. He had found a reason to keep moving, to keep searching the dark for the remnants of those who had come before. The journey was far from over, and the stars seemed brighter now, as if they were waiting for him to tell their story. Silas closed his eyes and let the ship take him into the deep, his thoughts already light years away. The transit from the gravity well of O449 into the silent expanse of the void was usually a period of forced meditation for Silas, a time to let the physiological tremors of high-acceleration ascent fade into the steady hum of the life support systems. This time, however, the silence of the cockpit felt crowded. The data he had absorbed within the subterranean complex did not sit in his mind like a read-only file. It felt more like a low-frequency vibration at the base of his skull, a phantom limb that twitched with every blink of his eyes. He sat in the command cradle, his flight suit still damp with the sweat of the descent, watching the star charts on his primary monitor flicker and reset. The ship's navigation computer, a hardened unit designed to withstand the electromagnetic storms of binary pulsars, was struggling to reconcile the standard galactic coordinates with the conceptual map now etched into Silas's subconscious. He reached out to adjust the sensor gain, but his fingers hesitated over the physical toggles. In his mind, he could see the star systems not as isolated points of light, but as nodes in a vast, interconnected web of energy that spanned the entire sector. He saw the gravitational filaments that linked them, the hidden conduits of space-time that the builders of the complex had once used to traverse the galaxy with the ease of a man walking across a room. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of vertigo, as if the ship was suddenly moving at a velocity that the inertial dampeners could not possibly compensate for. He gripped the edges of the console until his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to focus on the tangible reality of the cockpit, the smell of ionized dust, the soft glow of the emergency lighting, the steady rhythm of his own pulse. He needed to find a place to ground himself, a way to translate the abstract images in his head into something the ship could understand. He began to input a series of manual overrides, bypassing the standard safety protocols that governed long-range jumps. He was no longer interested in the surveyor's mission. The task of cataloging mineral deposits and atmospheric compositions felt trivial, almost insulting, in the face of what he had discovered. He was looking for a specific signature, a resonance frequency that matched the golden mist of the crystal pillar. He found it buried deep within the background radiation of the sector, a faint, rhythmic pulse originating from a region of space that the official charts labeled as a gravitational dead zone. It was a place where stars went to die, a graveyard of burnt-out husks and collapsing nebulae that no sane pilot would enter. Silas did not hesitate. He engaged the primary drive, the pathbreaker groaning as the massive capacitors discharged their energy into the fold engine. The stars outside the viewport elongated into streaks of brilliant white, then vanished entirely as the ship slipped into the non-space of the transit. Usually, the jump was a period of sensory deprivation, a hollow interval between 2 points in reality, but this time Silas felt the ship being pulled toward a destination with a terrifying magnetic intensity. He was not just traveling, he was being summoned. The transit lasted for what felt like hours, though the ship's chronometer recorded only a few minutes. When the pathbreaker finally dropped back into real space, Silas was thrown forward against his restraints as the ship's sensors screamed in protest. He was not in an empty graveyard. He was in the center of a massive, artificial ring that circled a dying red giant, a structure so vast that it defied his immediate comprehension. The ring was not solid. It was composed of millions of interlocking segments, each the size of a small moon, held together by shimmering bridges of hard light. It was a Dyson structure, a monument to a civilization that had outgrown the limitations of planetary living. The red giant at the center was bloated and dim, its surface mottled with dark spots that looked like bruises on the skin of a rotting fruit. The ring itself was dark, its once vibrant cities now cold and silent, but as the pathbreaker drifted closer, Silas saw the faint, golden lights beginning to flicker to life along the inner rim. The ship had triggered a proximity sensor, an automated greeting that had been waiting for a visitor for 10,000 years. Silas checked his long-range comms, but there was nothing but static, a chaotic jumble of signals that sounded like the ghosts of a billion voices all shouting at once. He guided the ship toward one of the larger docking bays, a cavernous opening that breathed a faint, blue luminescence. As the pathbreaker passed through the atmospheric shield, the exterior noise of the vacuum was replaced by the low, resonant thrum of the ring's internal power grid. The docking bay was large enough to house a fleet of capital ships, but it was empty save for a few derelict husks that looked like they had been stripped for parts. Silas brought the ship down on a landing pad that adjusted its height to accommodate his vessel's landing struts, a small gesture of hospitality from a machine that didn't know its masters were gone. He shut down the engines, the sudden silence of the cockpit feeling heavier than ever. He didn't wait to check the atmospheric readings this time. He knew the air would be perfect, maintained by systems that were designed to last until the end of time. He unstrapped himself from the cradle and headed for the airlock, his movements driven by a frantic, almost feverish curiosity. When the outer door opened, he was greeted not by the scent of ozone, but by the smell of rain on warm stone, a synthetic memory of a home world that had likely been dust for eons. The hangar was vast, the ceiling lost in a haze of artificial clouds that drifted lazily through the upper reaches of the structure. He stepped onto the landing pad, his boots making a dull, hollow sound that echoed off the distant walls. He saw a series of transport tubes running along the walls, their glass-like surfaces shimmering with the same golden light he had seen on 0449. He walked toward the nearest terminal, a pedestal of black glass that rose from the floor as he approached. He placed his hand on the surface, and immediately his mind was flooded with a map of the entire ring. He saw the residential sectors, the industrial hubs, the vast agricultural gardens that had once fed billions, and at the very center, the spire of consensus, the seat of the rings governing intelligence. It was there that he would find the answers he sought. He stepped into a transport pod, a sleek, teardrop-shaped vessel that moved without any discernible vibration. As the pod accelerated, the hangar blurred into a streak of silver and blue, and Silas was treated to a panoramic view of the ring's interior. It was a world of impossible beauty and profound melancholy. He saw mountains that had been carved into the shapes of heroes, rivers of liquid light that flowed through canyons of crystal, and forests of metallic trees that swayed in a wind generated by massive atmospheric fans. It was a paradise, but it was a hollow one. There were no people, no animals, not even the smallest insect to break the perfect, static order of the machine. The pod slowed as it approached the spire of consensus, a needle of pure white light that pierced the very center of the ring's sky. Silas stepped out into a plaza of white marble, surrounded by statues of beings that looked almost human, but with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to hold the depth of the ocean. He walked toward the spire, his heart thudding against his ribs. The entrance was a simple archway, unguarded and open to the elements. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old parchment and dry earth. He found himself in a library that stretched as far as the eye could see, containing millions of physical scrolls and digital data cores. In the center of the room sat a single figure, a man who looked so much like Silas that for a moment he thought he was looking into a mirror. The man was dressed in a simple robe of woven silver, and his eyes were closed as if in deep thought. Silas approached cautiously, his hand on the hilt of his multi-tool, but the man did not move. It was only when Silas was a few feet away that he realized the man was not breathing. He was a biological construct, a synthetic vessel designed to house a consciousness that had long since departed. On the table in front of the construct lay a single physical book, its cover made of a material that looked like tan leather but felt like silk. Silas reached out and opened the book, the pages thin and brittle. It was written in a language he could not read, but as his eyes scanned the text, the golden light in his mind began to translate the symbols. It was a journal, a final testament from the last of the ring's inhabitants. They had not been destroyed by war or famine, they had simply grown tired. They had achieved everything they had set out to do, mastered every law of physics, conquered every disease, and explored every corner of the galaxy. They had reached a state of perfect harmony, and in that harmony they had found a profound, unshakable boredom. They had decided, collectively, to leave the physical realm and transcend into a state of pure energy, leaving behind their works as a monument to their existence. But they had left something behind, a failsafe for the species that would eventually find their ruins. Silas turned to the last page of the book and saw a series of coordinates, not for another star system, but for a point in time. It was a bridge to the past, a way to see the galaxy as it had been before the Great Silence. The construct suddenly opened its eyes, the pupils glowing with a faint, golden light. It looked at Silas, not with hostility, but with a weary, ancient kindness. It spoke, its voice a soft, melodic sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. It told Silas that he was the first of his kind to reach the ring, the first to prove that the drive for discovery was still alive in the universe. It told him that the knowledge he carried was a gift, but also a test. He could use it to lead his people to a new era of prosperity, or he could use it to follow the builders into the dark. The choice was his, but the construct warned him that every choice carried a price. The golden light in Silas's mind flared brighter, and he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, as if his heart were being squeezed by an invisible hand. The room began to spin, the library dissolving into a whirlwind of scrolls and data cores. He tried to speak, to ask the construct what he should do, but his voice was lost in the roar of the ring's awakening systems. The spire was beginning to fold, the white light intensifying until it was all he could see. He felt himself being lifted off the floor, his body weightless and fragile in the face of such immense power. He was being drawn into the very heart of the spire, into the center of the red giant itself. He closed his eyes and surrendered to the pull, the memories of the dead empire washing over him like a tide. He was no longer Silas the cartographer. He was a bridge between two worlds, a witness to the birth and death of a galaxy. The pain in his chest faded, replaced by a sense of profound, terrifying clarity. He knew what he had to do. He would return to the Pathbreaker, but he would not go back to the colonies. He would take the ship into the center of the sun, using the coordinates in the book to open a path to the beginning of everything. He would see the universe as it was meant to be seen, before the weight of history had crushed the life out of it. The light faded, and Silas found himself back in the transport pod, the spire of consensus receding into the distance. The construct was gone, the library was gone, but the book was still in his hand, a solid, tangible weight that reminded him of his purpose. He reached the hangar and boarded the Pathbreaker, his movements calm and purposeful. He engaged the engines, the ship vibrating with a newfound energy as it pulled away from the docking bay. He did not look back at the ring, nor at the dying red giant. He looked ahead, toward the coordinates that shimmered in his mind like a promise. The stellar cartographer was going home, not to the world where he was born, but to the world where everything had started. The journey would be long, and the risks were absolute, but for the first time in his life, Silas felt truly awake. The stars were no longer distant points of light, they were a map, and he finally knew how to read it. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Pathbreaker vanished into the light. The jump through the center of the red giant was not a transition through space so much as it was a dissolution of the self. Silas felt the hull of the Pathbreaker screaming as it entered the corona, the thermal shielding ionizing into a brilliant white shroud, that cloaked the viewports. Within the command cradle, the physical controls seemed to melt and reshape themselves beneath his fingertips, becoming fluid extensions of the golden data stream that now occupied the majority of his cognitive functions. The coordinates from the book acted as a gravitational tether, pulling the ship through a localized collapse of physics where time ceased to be a linear progression and became a vast, stagnant pool. He could see the structural integrity of his ship flickering in and out of existence, the titanium bulkheads turning to glass and then to liquid light before solidifying once more. The roar of the engines had long since faded, replaced by a sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering simultaneously in a vacuum. Silas did not feel fear. The consciousness he had touched in the spire had left a lingering numbness in his emotional core, a sense of detached inevitability that allowed him to watch the destruction of his reality with clinical interest. He saw the history of the red giant unfolding in reverse, the star shrinking and brightening, its mottled surface smoothing into a pristine orb of golden fire as the ship moved backward through the epochs of its life. The Dyson structure outside the windows began to unbuild itself, the massive segments detaching and drifting away like the petals of a dying flower, returning to the raw mineral states from which they had been harvested. The ship was no longer traveling toward a destination, it was traveling toward a beginning. Then, with a suddenness that felt like a physical impact, the light vanished. The pathbreaker tumbled into a region of space that was utterly, terrifyingly empty. The stars were gone, replaced by a uniform charcoal gray expanse that lacked even the faintest glimmer of background radiation. Silas checked his instruments, but the displays were blank, the needles pinned at zero. He was in the void between the first breath of the universe and the birth of the first star, a period of cosmic gestation that the charts had always described as a theoretical impossibility. The ship's life support systems were the only thing keeping the silence at bay, their mechanical hum a thin, fragile thread connecting him to the concept of life. He sat in the darkness, the manual for the ancient builders resting heavy on his lap, and waited for the void to speak. It did not take long. A faint ripple appeared in the darkness ahead of the ship, a distortion in the nothingness that looked like heat haze on a summer road. As the pathbreaker drifted closer, the distortion resolved into a massive, shimmering gate constructed from the same translucent crystal he had found on O449. It was not a building or a machine, but a localized tier in the fabric of the non-verse, held open by the sheer will of the intelligence that had created it. Silas engaged the thrusters, the ship's movements sluggish in the absence of a meaningful gravitational field. He steered the vessel toward the center of the gate, the crystal edges glowing with a soft, violet light as the hull passed between them. On the other side of the gate, the universe was on fire. He had emerged into a nursery of galaxies, a chaotic, beautiful mess of gas clouds and newborn suns that collided and merged in a frantic dance of creation. The colors were more vivid than anything Silas had ever seen, greens and pinks and electric blues that bled into one another like watercolor paint on a wet canvas. There was no cold vacuum here. The sensors indicated that the ambient temperature of space was almost temperate, warmed by the incredible density of the young stars. The pathbreaker was tiny, a speck of dust in a storm of giants, but it moved with a purpose that the stars did not possess. Silas looked at the book again, the pages now glowing with a light that matched the violet hue of the gate. The instructions were no longer in text. They were in the form of a rhythmic vibration that pulsed through the leather cover and into his palms. He was being guided toward a specific point in the chaos, a small rocky planet that was being formed in the lee of a massive, sapphire-colored nebula. He adjusted the pitch of the ship, the engines firing with a renewed vigor as if they too could sense the importance of their destination. The planet was a molten ball of slag, its surface a chaotic landscape of lava rivers and volcanic plumes that reached miles into the toxic atmosphere. It was the most inhospitable place Silas had ever encountered, yet it was also the most precious. This was the Seed World, the original laboratory where the builders had first experimented with the synthesis of biological life. He descended into the atmosphere, the heat shielding of the ship turning a dull, angry red as it fought against the friction of the dense gases. He landed the pathbreaker on a bridge of cooled basalt that spanned a gorge of liquid fire, the landing struts hissing as they made contact with the superheated stone. He did not wait for the airlock to cycle this time. He knew his suit would not be enough to protect him from the conditions outside. Instead, he utilized the ship's external manipulator arms to retrieve a small metallic canister from a hidden compartment in the flooring of the hangar. The canister was unmarked, but he knew what it contained: the genetic echoes of 1 billion lost souls, the distilled essence of the civilization that had built the ring and the spire. He moved the manipulator arm with the precision of a surgeon, lowering the canister into the mouth of a nearby volcanic vent. As the metal touched the lava, it did not melt. It began to expand, its surface unfolding like a complex geometric puzzle until it formed a shielded pod that could withstand the pressures of the planet's core. The pod sank into the liquid fire, carrying its cargo into the deep, where the heat and pressure would trigger the long, slow process of evolution. Silas watched the readout on his monitor as the pod reached the planetary mantle and locked itself into place. He had completed the task. He had planted the seeds of the future in the soil of the past, ensuring that the cycle of life would begin again, guided by the lessons of those who had come before. He felt a sudden, profound sense of peace, a clarity that washed away the last of the golden fog in his mind. He was no longer a man burdened by the memories of a dead empire. He was the gardener of a new one. He returned to the command cradle and prepared to leave the molten world, but as he reached for the controls, the ship's primary computer flickered to life. A message appeared on the screen, written in the clear, concise script of his own people. It was not from the builders, but from the colonial authority he had left behind weeks ago. They had tracked his signature through the jump, their long-range scanners picking up the massive energy discharge of the Red Giant's collapse. They were demanding his immediate return, threatening him with charges of desertion and the theft of state property. Silas looked at the message, then at the chaotic, beautiful universe outside his window. He realized then that he could never go back. The world he had come from was a place of limits and rules, a narrow existence that could not possibly understand the scale of what he had witnessed. He was a citizen of the beginning now, a traveler in a time that didn't belong to him. He deleted the message and disabled the ship's transponder, cutting the final thread that linked him to his old life. He engaged the drive, but instead of heading back toward the gate, he steered the pathbreaker toward the heart of the Sapphire Nebula. There were other worlds to seed, other stories to start, and a whole universe of light waiting to be discovered. The stellar cartographer had finished his map of the known stars, and now he was going to draw the rest. He pushed the throttle forward, the ship leaping into the colorful clouds of gas with a joyous, unburdened roar. He was Silas, the man who had seen the end and chose to start again, and the stars were his to name. The journey was no longer about finding a way home. It was about finding out how far he could go before the light finally went out. He smiled as the first of the nebula's radiation storms hit the hull, the ship dancing through the lightning like a bird on the wing. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The interior of the Sapphire Nebula was not the empty expanse Silas had anticipated, but a dense thicket of ionized gas and drifting silicate clusters that rattled against the hull like hail on a tin roof. The pathbreaker moved through this radiant fog with a predatory grace, its sensors recalibrated to detect the subtle shifts in the gravitational tide that suggested the presence of planetary bodies. Silas sat in the darkened cockpit, the only light coming from the violet glow of the ancient book resting on his lap and the soft, rhythmic pulsing of the ship's internal diagnostics. He felt a strange synchronization with the vessel. Every groan of the stressed metal felt like a pull in his own muscles, and the hum of the fusion reactor resonated in the hollow of his chest. He was no longer navigating by coordinates or stellar landmarks. He was following the pull of the genetic legacy he had just released into the molten world. He was looking for the other nurseries, the secondary sites mentioned in the final pages of the journal, where the builders had intended to foster different branches of the evolutionary tree. The nebula acted as a natural shield, hiding these experiments from the harsh radiation of the newborn suns, creating pockets of stability where life could take hold in ways that defied the logic of the inner colonies. He navigated through a corridor of shimmering turquoise dust, the ship's external cameras capturing images of celestial structures that looked like frozen waterfalls of light. As he pushed deeper into the core of the nebula, the density of the gas increased, forcing him to divert more power to the forward shields. The console sparked, a small puff of acrid smoke rising from the navigation array, but Silas did not look away from the viewport. He saw a shape looming in the distance, a dark silhouette against the vibrant backdrop of the nebula. It was a planet, but not one formed of rock and metal. It was a gas giant of immense proportions, its atmosphere a swirling vortex of emerald and gold. Orbiting this giant were dozens of moons, each one a unique laboratory of environment and chemistry. Silas felt the book pulse in his hand, a sharp, insistent vibration that directed him toward the smallest of these moons, a jagged orb of ice and silver that sat on the very edge of the giant's rings. He brought the pathbreaker into a low orbit, the ship's sensors struggling to penetrate the thick crust of frozen methane that covered the moon's surface. Below the ice, however, the thermal scanners detected a massive ocean of liquid water, kept warm by the tidal forces exerted by the gas giant. This was the second site, a cradle for a life form that would never know the sun, but would instead thrive in the crushing pressure and absolute darkness of the deep. Silas began the landing sequence, but he did not seek a solid surface. He directed the ship toward a massive fissure in the northern hemisphere, a canyon of ice that descended miles into the interior of the moon. The pathbreaker dived into the crack, its landing lights cutting through the blue-white walls of the abyss. The air grew thinner and then vanished entirely as he entered the vacuum of the subglacial cavern. He reached the point where the ice met the water, a transition zone of slush and freezing mist that coated the hull in a layer of frost. He deployed the secondary probe, a streamlined torpedo-shaped vessel that carried the second canister of genetic material. The probe vanished into the dark water, its progress tracked by a single, flickering dot on Silas's monitor. He watched as the probe descended through the layers of the ocean, passing through forests of hydrothermal vents that looked like glowing chimneys on the seafloor. He saw flashes of movement in the peripheral cameras, not creatures yet, but the chemical precursors of life, organized into complex chains by the machinery the builders had left behind. The probe reached the floor of the ocean and anchored itself near a cluster of vents, releasing its cargo into the nutrient-rich currents. Silas felt a surge of triumph, but it was quickly overshadowed by a warning chime from the ship's tactical computer. He had been so focused on the mission that he had neglected to monitor the local space for intruders. He checked the long-range radar and felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. A fleet of colonial interceptors had emerged from the nebula's edge, their signatures sharp and aggressive. They had not followed him through the sun. They had used the data from his initial jump to calculate his probable exit point and had been waiting for him to reappear. They were moving in a pincer formation, designed to trap him against the moon's gravity well. Silas knew he couldn't outrun them in the thick gas of the nebula, and the pathbreaker was not equipped for a direct engagement. He had to use the environment to his advantage. He retracted the probe's umbilical and fired the thrusters, the ship lurching upward through the ice canyon just as the first volley of kinetic slugs impacted the surface of the moon above him. The shockwave rattled the cavern, sending massive shards of ice tumbling toward the ship. Silas steered through the falling debris with a frantic, desperate intensity, his hands blurring across the controls. He broke through the surface and into the thin atmosphere, seeing the 4 interceptors closing in. They were sleek, black vessels, devoid of the markings of the exploration fleet, which meant they were part of the Colonial Enforcement Division, men who were paid to bring back assets or destroy them. A voice crackled over the emergency frequency, distorted by the nebula's interference. It was a cold, robotic tone that demanded his immediate surrender and the handing over of the unauthorized artifacts he had recovered. Silas didn't respond. He dived toward the rings of the gas giant, a chaotic field of ice boulders and dust that would provide cover from their targeting systems. The interceptors followed, their engines flaring with a bright blue light as they pushed their reactors to the limit. Silas wove the pathbreaker through the ring plane, the ship's hull scraping against ice fragments as he pushed the limits of the inertial dampeners. He could feel the heat of the enemy's laser locks on his tail, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He needed a way to lose them, and he needed it now. He looked at the ancient book, which was now vibrating with a rhythmic frequency that matched the rotation of the gas giant itself. He realized that the giant was not just a planet, it was a gravitational lens, a massive tool left behind by the builders to manipulate the fabric of space. He steered the ship toward the Great Eye, a massive storm on the giant's surface that had raged for 1 billion years. The interceptors hesitated, their pilots unwilling to follow a ship into a vortex that could crush a battleship, but Silas didn't stop. He knew that the center of the storm was a point of absolute stillness, a gateway similar to the one he had passed through at the Red Giant. He entered the outer bands of the storm, the pathbreaker being tossed like a leaf in a hurricane. The screaming of the wind was audible even through the pressurized hull, a deafening roar that drowned out the sound of the engines. He saw the interceptors firing one last, desperate volley before they were forced to peel away, their structures unable to withstand the atmospheric pressure. Silas pushed deeper, his vision blurring as the G-forces climbed. He reached the eye wall, a wall of clouds that rose 50 miles into the sky, and then suddenly he was through. The center of the storm was a calm, clear cylinder of air, where the stars of the nebula were visible overhead. In the center of this void floated a crystalline station, a smaller version of the ring he had visited before. He guided the pathbreaker toward the station's docking arm, his movements slow and deliberate. As the ship locked into place, Silas collapsed back into his seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had escaped, but he knew the colonies wouldn't stop. They had seen enough to know that he possessed something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy, and they would hunt him to the ends of the universe to get it. He looked at the station's interior through the viewport, seeing rows of dormant ships that looked like his own, but far more advanced. This was a staging area, a place where the builders had prepared their final departure. He realized that he didn't have to keep running alone. He had the keys to a fleet that could protect the seed worlds he had planted. He stood and made his way toward the airlock, the book held tightly in his hand. He was no longer just a gardener, he was a guardian. The transition from a lone explorer to a leader of a ghost fleet was a daunting one, but as he stepped onto the station's polished deck, Silas felt a strange sense of belonging. The station recognized him, its lights flickering to life in a warm, welcoming sequence. He walked toward the command center, his boots echoing in the vast, empty halls. He had work to do, and for the first time, he had the tools to do it right. The stars were still far away, but they felt a little closer now. He reached the central console and placed his hand on the interface, feeling the station's systems merge with his own mind. He saw the locations of all the other nurseries, all the other gates, and all the other secrets the builders had left behind. He smiled, a thin, determined line on his face. Let them come, he thought. The universe is much bigger than they think. The crystalline station at the heart of the Great Eye operated with a logic that transcended mere mechanical function, responding to Silas's presence as if it were a long-awaited neurological impulse. As he stood at the central console, the station's interface did not require him to manipulate physical dials or touch holographic screens. Instead, it reached into his mind, using the golden resonance already established on O449 to create a seamless link between his consciousness and the dormant fleet. He saw the ships, hundreds of them, sleek and translucent like the spines of a deep-sea creature, arranged in perfect geometric formations within the station's substructure. They were not powered by combustion or fusion, but by the same gravitational manipulation that kept the station suspended within the eternal storm. Silas felt the weight of the task ahead of him, a responsibility that eclipsed his previous life as a solitary cartographer. He was no longer mapping the universe for the sake of colonial expansion. He was coordinating the defense of life itself. The colonial interceptors that had pursued him were merely the vanguard of a much larger force, driven by a desperate need to possess technology they could not hope to understand. He could feel the ripples in the gravitational field of the nebula as more ships arrived, their warp signatures leaving jagged scars in the fabric of the gas clouds. They were coming for the seed worlds, for the potential power locked within the genetic canisters he had sown. Silas closed his eyes, his mind expanding to fill the station's sensory network, and began the process of awakening the fleet. One by one, the ships began to glow with a faint, violet luminescence, their internal systems humming to life in a synchronized chorus that vibrated through the floorboards. There were no pilots for these vessels, only automated subroutines that waited for Silas to provide the intent. He did not give them commands in the traditional sense. He shared his vision of protection, of a sanctuary where the new life could grow unmolested by the greed of the old world. The ships detached from their moorings, moving through the station's atmospheric shields with a fluidity that made the pathbreaker look like a clumsy relic. Silas directed them to form a defensive perimeter around the gas giant and its moons, creating a web of interdiction fields that would prevent any unauthorized vessel from entering the system. As the first of the colonial destroyers broke through the outer bands of the nebula, they found themselves facing a wall of light that did not respond to their hailing frequencies or their threats. The colonial commander, a man whose voice crackled with the arrogance of an officer who had never lost a skirmish, demanded that Silas surrender the station and the illegal technology he was hoarding. Silas did not answer with words. He watched as the colonial ships fired their primary batteries, the massive kinetic slugs and high-energy beams splashing harmlessly against the violet shields of the Ghost Fleet. The technology of the builders did not fight with the same violence as the colonials. It simply negated the impact, absorbing the energy and recycling it into the station's own power grid. It was a lesson in the futility of aggression, but the colonials were not quick to learn. They intensified their barrage, their ships moving into a tight formation that concentrated their fire on a single point in the perimeter. Silas felt the strain on the network, a sharp ache behind his eyes as he balanced the energy distribution across hundreds of nodes. He realized that he could not simply wait for them to give up. He had to show them the scale of what they were facing. He commanded a small detachment of the Ghost Fleet to move forward, their hulls shimmering as they phased in and out of real space. They did not fire back at the destroyers. Instead, they began to manipulate the local gravity, creating small, controlled singularities that tugged at the colonial ships, pulling them out of formation and spinning them like tops in the vacuum. The colonial pilots panicked, their sleek black vessels colliding with one another as they struggled to maintain control against forces they had only seen in theoretical physics models. Silas watched the chaos with a heavy heart, knowing that many of the men on those ships were simply following orders, unaware of the cosmic stakes of their mission. But he could not allow them to reach the ice moon or the molten world. He had to be the wall that the tide of human ambition broke against. He reached deeper into the station's memory, looking for a way to end the conflict without total destruction. He found a protocol buried in the archives, a siren's call that the builders had once used to redirect lost or hostile vessels away from their restricted sectors. It was a non-lethal pulse of information, a sensory overload that would temporarily disable the electronics and the crew's cognitive functions, giving them time to reconsider their path. Silas triggered the pulse, and a wave of golden light erupted from the station, washing over the entire colonial fleet. The effect was immediate. The firing stopped, and the destroyers drifted aimlessly, their lights flickering and their engines cutting out. For several minutes, the nebula was silent, the only movement coming from the slow, rhythmic swirl of the gas clouds. Silas waited, his hand still resting on the interface, watching the life signs on the enemy ships stabilize. They were not dead, merely dreaming, their minds filled with the same history of the builders that had changed Silas on O449. He hoped that when they woke, they would understand that the universe was not a resource to be plundered, but a legacy to be protected. As the colonial ships began to regain power, they did not resume their attack. They sat motionless for a long time, as if the crews were trying to reconcile the visions they had seen with the reality of their mission. Finally, one by one, the destroyers turned around and began to move back toward the edge of the nebula, their movements slow and somber. They were leaving not out of fear, but out of a sudden, profound realization of their own insignificance. Silas watched them go until they were nothing more than fading sparks in the distance. Then he slumped against the console, his strength spent. The defense had been successful, but he knew this was only the beginning. There were other colonies, other factions, and other threats that would eventually find their way to this corner of the universe. He could not remain the sole guardian of these worlds forever. He looked at the Pathbreaker, sitting in the docking bay, and then at the vast, empty halls of the station. He needed to find others like himself, people who were willing to trade their lives in the colonies for a life among the stars, protecting the seeds of the future. He began to broadcast a signal, not a distress call, but an invitation, encoded in the same resonance that the builders had used to find him. It was a call to the dreamers, the explorers, and the misfits who felt the weight of the silence between the stars. He told them of the ring, the spire, and the nurseries within the nebula. He told them that there was a place for them here if they were brave enough to find it. As he finished the broadcast, he felt a soft touch on his shoulder. He turned to find the construct from the spire standing behind him, its eyes glowing with a calm, approving light. It didn't speak, But Silas understood that he had passed the second test. He had defended the life he had planted without becoming the very thing he was protecting them from. The construct gestured toward the far end of the command center, where a new set of coordinates was beginning to form on the display. These were not for another nursery or another station. They were for the original home world of the builders, a place that had been hidden since the dawn of time. Silas knew that his journey was not ending here. It was simply entering a new phase. He would leave the station in the hands of the Ghost Fleet's automated systems and take the Pathbreaker into the deep once more. He would find the origins of the people who had mastered the stars and see if there was any trace of them left in the physical world. He walked back to his ship, his steps light and confident. The stellar cartographer had found his purpose, and the stars were no longer a mystery to be solved, but a garden to be tended. He boarded the Pathbreaker and prepared for departure, the ship's engines humming with the same violet energy as the station. He looked out at the great eye one last time, seeing the beauty of the storm and the promise of the worlds he had saved. He pushed the throttle forward, and the ship vanished into the light, headed for the heart of the galaxy. The universe was waiting, and Silas was ready to meet it. The transition to the final coordinates was unlike any jump Silas had previously experienced. Rather than the violent folding of space or the silent slide into the non-verse, the Pathbreaker seemed to dissolve into a state of pure conceptual existence. The physical boundaries of the cockpit fell away, leaving Silas suspended in a medium that felt like warm, liquid thought. He could see the structural integrity of his vessel not as a series of metal plates and bolts, but as a blueprint of intention, a physical manifestation of his desire to explore the unknown. The ancient book in his lap was no longer a physical object. It had merged with his own consciousness, its pages unfolding in his mind like the petals of a flower blooming in fast motion. He was no longer Silas the man or Silas the guardian, but a singular point of awareness navigating the primordial currents of the universe's own memory. The destination was not a planet in the traditional sense, but a convergence point where the physical and the metaphysical intersected, the cradle of the first thought. As the sensation of movement stabilized, the ship reformed around him, its systems humming with a low, resonant frequency that matched the vibrations of the space outside. Silas looked through the viewport and saw a world that defied every law of planetary formation he had ever studied. It was a sphere of pure white marble, thousands of miles in diameter, polished to a mirror finish and etched with silver circuits that spanned entire continents. There was no atmosphere, no clouds, and no sun. The world was illuminated by its own internal radiance, a soft, pearlescent glow that pushed back the absolute darkness of the surrounding void. This was the home world of the builders, the origin point from which all their engineering and all their dreams had sprung. Silas guided the Pathbreaker toward the surface, the ship's landing thrusters unnecessary as a gentle gravitational beam caught the hull and lowered it toward a massive plaza at the North Pole. The landing was silent, the ship settling onto the white marble with a grace that felt like a benediction. Silas unsealed his helmet, discovering that the air within the plaza was not only breathable, but enriched with a subtle energy that made his every sense feel preternaturally sharp. He stepped out onto the boarding ramp, his boots making a soft, melodic chime as they touched the polished stone. The plaza was surrounded by soaring arches that reached toward the stars, each one inscribed with the history of 1 billion years of evolution. In the center of the plaza stood a single monument, a tall, tapering spire of black glass that seemed to absorb the light around it. As Silas approached the spire, he saw that it was not a monument to a person or an event, but a living archive of the builder's final days. He placed his hand on the glass, and the surface rippled like water, revealing a series of images that played out across the dark surface. He saw the builders at the height of their power, a civilization that had moved galaxies like chess pieces and harvested the breath of dying stars. But he also saw the moment they realized they had reached the end of their potential. They had solved every riddle, conquered every fear, and understood every law of the cosmos. They had reached a state of perfect stasis, where there was nothing left to learn and nowhere left to go. Instead of despairing, they had chosen to become the foundations for the next cycle. They had disassembled their physical bodies and integrated their consciousness into the very fabric of the universe, leaving behind the seeds of life in the nurseries Silas had visited, waiting for someone with the drive for discovery to find them and start the clock once more. Silas realized then that he was the intended heir to this entire reality. The humanity he belonged to was not just a biological fluke on a distant, dusty world. It was a curated legacy, a vessel for the same curiosity that had driven the builders across the void. The call he had broadcast from the station in the Great Eye had already reached its mark. As he stood before the spire, he saw the first of the colonial dreamers arriving, not in warships or interceptors, but in makeshift vessels, exploration pods, and repurposed freighters. They were the ones who had felt the pull of the golden light, the ones who had seen the truth behind the veil of colonial politics and corporate greed. They landed their ships across the white marble plaza, their faces filled with the same wonder that Silas had felt when he first touched the stone on 0449. He watched as they emerged from their ships, a diverse group of engineers, poets, and wanderers, all drawn by a promise they couldn't quite name. Silas stepped forward to meet them, no longer a lone traveler, but a bridge between the ancient past and the uncertain future. He shared with them the knowledge he had gained, the locations of the nurseries, and the secrets of the Ghost Fleet. He told them that they were not here to rule or to conquer, but to serve as the gardeners of a newborn galaxy. Together, they would watch over the life in the molten world and the ice moon, ensuring that the next generation of sentient beings would have the chance to grow without the shadows of the old world's mistakes. As the years passed, the cradle of the first thought became a beacon of light in the darkness. The marble world was transformed into a city of learning and peace, a place where the archives of the builders were translated and taught to all who sought them. Silas remained the warden of the spire, his life extended by the same energies that powered the world around him. He watched as the first civilizations began to emerge on the seed worlds, primitive but vibrant cultures that looked at the stars with a sense of kinship rather than fear. The colonial authorities had tried to reclaim the sector once or twice, but they were no match for a civilization that lived in harmony with the fundamental laws of space. Eventually, even the colonies began to change, the influence of the dreamers trickling back to the inner worlds and sparking a renaissance of exploration and empathy. Silas would often sit on the edge of the great plaza, watching the ships of the new guardians depart for distant corners of the nebula. He knew that his own journey was far from over, for the universe was infinite, and there were always more maps to be drawn. He looked up at the stars, which no longer seemed cold or indifferent, but like a garden waiting for the spring. He felt the ancient book pulse one last time in his mind, a final message of gratitude from the builders, and then it was gone, leaving him with a profound, unshakable peace. He was Silas, the stellar cartographer, and he had finally found where he belonged. The story of the First Empire had ended, but the story of the next was just beginning, written in the light of 1,000 new suns and the hearts of those who dared to look up and wonder. He stood, his shadow long against the white marble, and walked toward the horizon where the next adventure waited.